and welcome to this session of on Farmers for Earth, deploying nature-based solutions in agriculture for disaster and climate resilience, which Gorakhpur Environmental Action Group and Earth Day Network Asia, they're jointly organizing. And welcome you all. Thank you so much for coming. I'll request, without losing any time, I will request the Regional Director, Earth Day Network, Dr. Karuna Singh, to please come on the join on the dais, and then also the panelists, Dr. Aditya Bahadur, Ms. Nivedita Mani, Mr. Saqib Haq, and Louise. Can I request you all to please join? So primarily, this session actually deals with the farmers for the earth. And when we talk on the farmers for earth, we have seen in both Asia and Africa and also in Latin America, in whole of the global south, how the ecosystem services are helpful in building the resilience for the farmers. And when we talk of the farmers, it is mainly the small and marginal landholding farmers, the women farmers, how closely they are associated with the nature-based solution and the ecosystem services. And with gradually dying down or ignorance of or ignoring the conservation, rejuvenation, protection of the ecosystem, natural ecosystems, the problem is directly impacting the farmers more when they face the climate change impact. So welcome to this session. We have 4 panelists here, on the dais. And after the talking of the 4 panelists, we will have 2 discussants who will be summing up and evolving the policy recommendations coming out from different speakers as well as the audience, if they have any inputs to suggest. So with this, I will request Karuna Singh ji to please say a few opening remarks. She is the Regional Director of Earth Day Network and also the Head of Earth Day Network in India. Karuna Singh.
Thank you, Dr. Vaji. It's always a pleasure working with you. I am with Earth Day Network, also known as earthday.org, which is our new name. In India, we have a program called Farmers for Earth. This was inspired by Dr. Vaji. He said that, so many farmers, they need to do special programs that will contain their soil, that will make sure that their soil is not as chemically filled as it was before. And he told me about a lot of cases where people on the grassroots level have come up with solutions, like somebody in his district, a lady who is doing something called matka khad, where it is very simple to develop a fertilizer not using any chemicals. So inspired by him, what we did was we created a platform for farmers. We brought together farmers from one state with scientists, with people on the ground, and with their people who are going to do the marketing, so that solutions were found. And after 25 of these webinars that we held, we brought together all the solutions that are possible, so that with climate change raging, we don't lose time, but we learn from what is already there without reinventing the wheel. So thank you all for coming here, and I'll hand it back to Dr. Vaji.
Thank you, Karuna ji. And with this, why this session? That is also one point actually which I would like to introduce. We have seen over a period of almost 2 or 3 decades that how closely the small farmers, the small landholding farmers are associated with the ecosystems and the ecosystem services. And recently, in the last few decades, we have seen that the nature-based solutions are so crucial for developing their resilience capacity. And we see there is a win-win situation between the way traditionally the small farmers have been associated with the ecosystem services. One, directly by accessing the food, fodder, fuel, and those kind of services. When we look at the integrated farming system of a small landholding farmer, which involves both the livestock as well as the agriculture field and the farmer's household itself. So this makes a complete farm system, and in this farm system, the inputs actually which is received by the ecosystem which are around the village or around the agricultural field, that is coming in form of fodder, fuel, food, and so on. The second thing is that the ecosystem services are also providing or contributing to the resilience capacity indirectly by recharging the water or maybe conservation of the water, providing the buffering capacity in these areas where it is floods and waterlogging, in the drought situation, and so on. So with these kind of services, if these services are gradually being degenerated, the impact is more and exacerbated when the climate change impacts are observed on the small farmers. The second point is that the resilience capacity of the farmers, the ecosystem services, they have the shock bearing capacity. The stresses and the shocks which are coming, whether it is economic shocks or it is the meteorological or hydrometeorological shocks, if those shocks are coming, the ability to deal with those stresses is also very important, and these ecosystems provide those kind of abilities to the small farmers. And when we say small farmers, it is mainly the women farmers who are closely associated with these services. The third point which I would like to hear and will request the panelists also to respond is that in the policy arena, the conservation and rejuvenation of the ecosystem services are largely in silos. They are not associated as a part of the larger agriculture ecosystem or involving both the farmer's field and the ecosystem which are in the landscape which is available there. So that is also one point which we would like to touch here. And we all know that how the ecosystem services have been degenerated or how ecosystems have degenerated. Now we know that most of the farmland, the soil quality, the natural soil quality has gone down, whether it is poor level or very poor level or at least at a fair level. And the second thing is that if we look at from the 1900s, this century, the last century, almost 64% to 71% of the wetlands, they have completely gone. So with these kind of degenerative systems or degenerative mechanisms, the survival of the small and marginal farmers and struggling with their survival is a question which need to be addressed on a priority. And the way nature-based solutions are based on the ecosystem services we all are aware of. So with these introductory remarks, I will request the first panelist who is with us is Dr. Aditya Bahadur. And just to introduce you, Aditya. Aditya is a specialist in climate resilient urban development, transformative approaches for risk reduction, monitoring and evaluation of resilience initiatives, designing and delivering research and learning programs on climate and development, supporting government in policy and institutional development for resilience, focus on South and Southeast Asia. He's also the one of the main force behind the ARA network, Adaptation Research Alliance Network. So with these words, Aditya, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vaji. You missed out one very important component of my biography, is that I started my career as an intern in the Gorakhpur Environmental Action Group. Okay. Great. I think this is a vitally important. Should I go there? I think this is a vitally important topic that we are discussing today. I don't need to tell the people in this room that 2/3 of many large developing countries are involved in agriculture. So if we're not thinking systematically and rigorously about the resilience of agricultural systems, we're really going to miss the boat on reducing vulnerability at scale. And while there are people on the panel who can speak to the nature-based solutions aspect of this discussion much better than I can, I will try and focus on the climate and disaster resilience aspect of agricultural systems. Oh, great. Thank you. I only have, since I've been given 5 minutes, I'm going to stick to only one slide. I was involved for 3 years with IIED, ICAT, and others in great in a big UK government-funded program called Action on Climate Today. It was quite a remarkable program unfolding across Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, focused on providing direct technical support to national and subnational governments on mainstreaming climate risk in different sectors of policy. And one of the 4 main areas that we worked on was agriculture. And across the 11 project locations dotted across South Asia, almost in each one, we did something on climate resilient agriculture. And then we took a step back and said, surely all the work that we've done cannot just end here. We need to kind of extract what we've learned from all these interventions on how to make agriculture more resilient. And through that process, we developed this fairly simple framework, but I think it's useful, and organizations, including the World Food Programme, have used this as a tool for strategy planning at the international level as well as at the country level. And all this says is that the initial instinct of people when they talk about climate resilient agriculture to focus on production processes and making those more resilient is right, but that's not the full story. We need to work across the agricultural value chain, all the way from pre-production to marketing and post-marketing, to make sure that agricultural systems are comprehensively made resilient. And what we found through our experience of running this program was that apart from these different phases of the value chain, there were at least 4 clear entry points for making agriculture more resilient. You could do things with policy and institutions. You could do things with providing more and different kinds of finance. You could talk about new kinds of information, knowledge, and insights. Or you could work on the technology and asset management aspect of agriculture. Now, I won't take you through every single grid in this framework, but I'll illustrate what I mean with a couple of quick examples. So when we talk about pre-production and the policy and institutional entry point, what we could do is take existing policies and mainstream climate change risk within it. So in giving you an illustration of this, the government of Bihar, one of India's poorest states, came to the program and said, we're about to initiate a new agricultural policy. We realize that it doesn't speak to the impacts of climate change. Can you take it, tweak it, so the agricultural policy is relevant in the face of the climate impacts that Bihar is going to face through the duration of the policy, which was 10 years, I think. So we looked at the policy, and then we made tweaks to it, advising the government on the kinds of seeds that they need to propagate on production techniques, on harvesting techniques, on marketing techniques that the policy needed to speak to, that needed to be climate resilient. When it comes to the finance piece, and let's look at another chain in the value chain. Let's look at the production part of it. Water pricing policy has a critical aspect on what is grown, how it is grown in the phase of production. Tweaking this slightly can have a big impact on whether your agriculture is resilient to different kinds of shocks and stresses or whether it is vulnerable. And so reviewing water pricing regime and increasingly the nexus of energy and water can really influence how you grow rice or whether you grow rice in a particular area or not. If electricity is free for farmers, it can lead to rice production, but at the cost of rampant groundwater extraction. So, this is a tweak that you could make. And then moving down to the information and knowledge management entry point, when we talk about the marketing end of the value chain, if we talk about reduced food wastage, that can have upstream advantages for the resilience of what crops are grown. And finally, for the technology and asset management entry point, you can do a whole range of things. For instance, in the marketing phase, you could establish contingency plans for warehousing, and you could look at the climate proofing of warehouses to enhance agriculture. So all we're trying to say here is think comprehensively, think systematically, and think across the different types of interventions that can be made in an agricultural system to make it resilient, as opposed to business as usual, which is thinking about the farmer on the farm while he is farming. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aditya, for touching on these points. While we were planning this session, we were thinking of the people actually whom we should request, and we tried to request people actually from different, not only from different geographies, but also from different sectors. So people like Aditya from the part of the great networks, to action research people, to kind of researchers, and also the mitigation. So all the range of issues actually, range of sectors which we are trying to identify. So with this, thank you, Aditya, and I'll request the next speaker, who is Nivedita Mani. She is a development professional with over 19 years of experience in the sector. She leads the Action Research and Communication Initiative of Gorakhpur Environmental Action Group. She has worked with several national and international organizations on rural and urban climate change resilience, integration of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in development planning, ecosystem-based resilience, water and sanitation, sustainable livelihood and gender. She has been the author of several process documentation, research reports, research papers, training manuals, and so on. She has more than 30 publications to her credit. So Nivedita, sharing on some of the action research aspects.
Thank you, sir. So since this session that we are having, we are talking about farmers for earth and how the nature-based solutions in agriculture can be deployed in various agro-climatic geographical settings, basically. And one of the settings that I am going to talk about is the peri-urban settings, which is the peri-urban areas which are basically located in the fringes of urban centers. They lie between, they are basically a continuum or a connect between the urban and rural areas in India. So, role of ecosystems in peri-urban agriculture. As I said, peri-urban areas are the zones of transition, basically from the rural to urban land uses, and they are located outside of the limits of the urban and regional centers, and they play a significant role in building resilience because a lot of the ecosystem services are being provided by the peri-urban areas located outside the urban centers. So coming straight away to the peri-urban agriculture and the ecosystem services that they provide, basically they play a crucial role for the peri-urban agriculture because a lot of agricultural activities are dependent on the ecosystem services there. And some of the 4 or 5 important roles that I can think of the ecosystem services for peri-urban agriculture. First thing is the local food, which is an important source of affordable local fresh produce for urban populations. Peri-urban agriculture and peri-urban areas play a very important role in providing this whole food supply to the urban centers because they also produce food and then supply the food. The second important role is also of the environmental management, wherein the nutrient cycling and the water purification and the recycling of the urban waste and the wastewater that's coming from the urban centers is also being dealt by the peri-urban areas. Hence, they play a very important role in the environmental management of the whole thing. Livelihoods, of course, yet another important thing because peri-urban areas are also the source of livelihoods and for not only for the casual laborers and for the poor and vulnerable groups also because a lot of services are also being provided from the peri-urban areas to the urban areas. The peri-urban ecosystems also help a lot in the flood mitigation, especially from the areas that we come from, in the flood-affected areas of UP and Bihar, wherein they create this resilient landscapes alongside the rivers, that it can act as a buffering capacity. It can provide the buffering capacity to the cities by absorbing the excess water that is coming down in the form of erratic rainfall or floods or waterlogging. And peri-urban ecosystems, because the natural ecosystems also help in mitigating the heat island effects, basically by providing a more cooling impact to the whole local environment. The local climate is also becoming a little, it provides a cooling effect to the local environment and the local climate. So that's also one of the important ecosystem role of the peri-urban agriculture in the peri-urban areas. One of the small case examples that I would like to speak about is the peri-urban agriculture in the Gorakhpur city. Gorakhpur is a small secondary city in the Uttar Pradesh state of India, located in the northern region of the country. And we did this learning lab initiative with the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network of the Rockefeller Foundation, wherein we developed this whole resilience strategy of the Gorakhpur city and also worked on strengthening the peri-urban agriculture and ecosystems for building urban resilience. And this was an important measure, basically, given the changing rainfall patterns and the rising flood risk potential that we are experiencing in this area over the period of time as an impact of climate change and the fast-growing urban development happening in the city. So some of the key interventions that the peri-urban agriculture in Gorakhpur city focused on was, one thing was to develop farm models with low external input and climate resilient agriculture practices, so that the overall net gains of the farmers are improved and their losses are also reduced. The second one was on weather and agro services provided by SMS messaging, wherein basically we provided this climate information, the local climate information to the farmers, clubbed with the crop advisories at what they should be doing in the next 5 days. And these advisories were sent out actually through SMS-based messaging systems on an interval of every 5 days to the farmers, so that they can take efficient and effective crop decisions and save on their losses, crop losses due to erratic rainfall and other climate impacts. Building community institutions at the local level was yet another important thing to bring the peri-urban farmers together in the form of self-help groups or farmer field schools and farmer clubs, so that they can collectively advocate, collectively learn on the resilient techniques and practices of agriculture in the peri-urban areas. And we also helped them to establish linkages with the government line departments. Peri-urban areas are considered as nobody's child in our country. Like, it's neither urban nor rural. So there is no proper governance mechanisms for those peri-urban areas. So a farmer in the peri-urban area does not know, or he cannot leverage resources or access to crop subsidies from the agriculture department, because it caters only to the rural areas. So these were kind of governance gaps were there, a lot of governance gaps, and with a lot of advocacy and working with the government line departments, we established these linkages for them so that they can sort of leverage some of the resources from the government line departments. Just a few pictures to share on what are the climate resilient farm models that we developed, like multi-tier farming systems, the mixed cropping systems. Very effective solid waste management system was set up, because a lot of the waste dumping happens from the city to the in the peri-urban areas. Some still farming and low till nurseries. The average agricultural income of these model farmers was enhanced by almost 30 to 35% due to reduced input costs and crop diversification techniques that we offered to them. And also they could reduce the crop losses due to natural hazards such as floods and some of the waterlogging impacts as well. The conservation of natural agriculture, land and ecosystems, I mean, the increased green cover, the plantation was also sort of promoted by these farmers. And the conservation of water bodies in these areas was also one of the things that was done. The wastewater management was done through decentralized systems. And in totality, actually, it was more of a community-led advocacy for saving and preserving the peri-urban agriculture in the peri-urban areas, because agriculture as a system should be conserved in those areas, and not that the land use gets changed very frequently. Well, this is just a slide. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but we have been working in the eastern region of India in several cities, several states of UP, Bihar, West Bengal, and Assam. And over a period of last 20 years, we have seen how the ecosystems are reducing, be it the forest cover, be it the floodplains, be it the bamboo plantation areas or the water bodies. So fast encroachment, maldevelopment practices, and haphazard, instead of maldevelopment, I would say haphazard development that is happening in the urban centers is leading to the degradation of these ecosystems and water bodies, which are hampering the overall resilience of cities. So that is one thing that we advocate for, that ecosystems need to be conserved if we need to talk about building resilience. So that's in short, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nivedita, for pointing out the crucial role of peri-urban ecosystems in terms of the livelihood of the people, of the farmers who are living adjoining the cities, but also for the sake of urban resilience, how important are the peri-urban ecosystems. With this, I move to Bangladesh, and we have Dr. Saqib Haq, who is program coordinator at ICARD. We know ICARD very well. I mean, the kind of good work which is being done, and especially the community-led initiatives in Bangladesh. He is based in Bangladesh. He has been in climate change and development sector for over 10 years, working across the least development countries, primarily in South Asia. His research areas focus on climate finance and international climate policies. He is also a trainer and capacity building mentor for the ICARD youth program, which focuses on developing local leadership of communities at the front lines of climate impact and fostering networks to enhance the local level climate actions. So, the youth from Bangladesh.
Thank you, Shiraz sir. I don't have any formal presentation, so I hope it's okay. I'll just speak from the panel here. So as Shiraz sir just mentioned, so one of the elements that we do work on is building what we call locally led adaptation, and with an emphasis on being the leadership, because quite often what we see when NGOs or even development programs work within communities, but not necessarily with communities. It's something that's done at the community level. It's done at a project that often the communities aren't even aware of until the week the project starts. It's not really building the leadership of the communities to sustain these projects, sustain these interventions going ahead. So some of the elements that we've been working with at the youth level at our program is working with local farmers and communities that are often very young farmers that are coming into the game, not being able to do the traditional practices that they've been done from their generations beforehand. And they're really trying innovations themselves. It's a trial and error from youth to try different things, tweak it a little bit, but they're doing it with meager resources of their own and quite a lot of effort on their own. So our aspect of building their leadership is more in developing these networks, giving them the collaborations that they need with local agencies, whether they be think tanks, whether they be NGOs, and particularly with local government agencies, where quite often young farmers, in particular young female farmers, have very little representation. They're not seen as somebody that comes with knowledge. They're not seen as somebody with backing. They're not seen as somebody that is an agency of their own. They're just seen as someone that has come for an advocacy or lobbying. And then it's just a tick box meeting that you've done with a local representative, and then after that, no action is taken. So developing these networks, giving them time to develop these collaborations with other young farmers within cooperatives, within other districts across Bangladesh as well as in other least developed countries, is really a way of giving them legacy, giving them some sustainable activities that they can fall back on. And again, linking with organizations such as ourselves, hosting events such as these, where we're able to bring the voices, bring in the youth representatives to speak at these, gives them that legitimacy. And that's really what we're trying to develop when we're saying that they need to be able to take leadership, is being able to give them the support that they need so that they can take the work forward. And really, I think sessions like this is really quite inspiring for us, and I hope to be able to contribute more in these activities going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saqib, for being very crisp and very much in time. And yeah, very rightly pointed out, the young farmers actually, the youth actually is the way they are moving out of the villages, and the agriculture becoming a kind of second priority or the third priority for the young farmers. I mean, that is also something which is alarming. And we have seen that in most of parts of the South Asia, the kind of migration, the youth migration which is happening, is mostly in the areas where which is primarily agriculture dependent. So that is a worry actually. I mean that this frustration from agriculture and youth moving out of the cities, out to the cities is how the survival of the agriculture will happen. So with this, thank you so much, Dr. Saqib Haq. And I'll move to the last speaker, who is Ms. Lois Wilson. She is the Climate Science Advisor, Research and Evidence Division, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in UK. To briefly introduce her, Lois Wilson is a senior climate scientist with more than 8 years experience working with multidisciplinary team to produce climate projections, as well as working with the users to translate projections into decision relevant information. She holds a PhD in applied and computational mathematics from Monash University, Australia. Lois joined the Met Office in 2020 from Australian Bureau of Meteorology, where she led the development of a national hydrological projections service which delivers Australia-wide estimate of future climate impact on the hydrological cycle. She was previously part of the joint team comprising Australian universities, CSIRO, and the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, which produces future climate projections for the Pacific and Australia. Currently, Lois is leading a project with the International Climate Service team at the Met Office to produce updated climate risk information for Ukraine, as well as working across the public and private sectors to improve climate services through the UK Climate Resilience Program. So Lois, please.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'd like to perhaps show you a specific example of how science can inform some of these adaptation options that we've heard about from other members of the panel, really bringing together, the importance of making informed decisions, based on really good information, but also making sure that you're really strongly engaging with the community in which you're hoping that these adaptations will actually work. So I'm going to talk briefly about a specific example from Africa for tea growers in Kenya, Malawi and Rwanda. So tea is a really important part of the economy in these countries. It's a really important cash crop, and it also is a really important part of livelihoods for tea growers. But tea is really sensitive to climate change itself, and this is for two reasons, or two main reasons. One is that tea is a sort of multi-decadal crop, so it really needs to be informed by information about what the long-term climate is likely to do when you're thinking about where to grow your tea. And tea is also highly sensitive, to climate variability. So if there's anything less than sort of ideal conditions, that can really affect the yield of your tea crop as well as the quality of your tea crop. And this has really important implications, obviously, for those tea growers, particularly smaller scale tea growers. So through something called the Future Climate for Africa program, which was a $20 million program funded by the UK, there was a project called CI for Tea, which is Climate Information for Tea, and it was where scientists engaged and worked really closely with farmers in Western Kenya and looked at the implications under a few different future scenarios of climate change to identify adaptation options for them for their tea growing. The project itself was a combination of some very high resolution modelling and scientists who used a convective permitting model in this region of Africa, as well as I mentioned, the really close engagement with the Kenyan farmers, which involved, a lot of trust, so that those farmers felt comfortable to share their data and their information about their farms. And then this information was integrated together, and some key climate risks for tea were identified for tea growers in this region. And those risks were I think I need to go to the next slide, sorry. Oops. No, I'll go back. Sorry. And what were those risks? So one of the future scenarios which were investigated under this project was what would happen or what are some adaptation options for tea under a much hotter future where there's been an increase in annual rainfall. Another scenario that was investigated under the CI for Tea program was for a warmer future where rainfall is about the same as today, but where the rainfall variability has changed and that rainfall is falling as less frequent but more heavy and more intense events with longer or prolonged dry spells in between each of these events. Really important for farmers, you know, and something which some of the farmers were possibly already seeing in their own experiences. And then a third scenario of future climate change that was investigated with the farmers was for a much hotter future where annual rainfall had actually decreased, so a drier future. So taking each of these risks in turn, in the case of sort of a hotter and warmer future, this could pose real threats kind of to the yield and to the quality of tea. And so one of the adaptation options that was explored was introducing shade plantings around plantations as a sort of nature-based solution for managing the amount of heat. There's lots of different examples of adaptation in these slides, and at the end of this slide deck you'll see that I've left some references there. You can go and explore all of these in an infographic, but I'm just going to give one or two for each one. In the case of a much sort of drier future where there's these prolonged dry spells, and tea farmers are really trying to manage, you know, the fact that rainfall isn't occurring on the seasonal cycle that they were previously used to. It might be one adaptation option for farmers there might be to come together and invest in sort of water management strategies. So that means things like infrastructure to store rainwater when it does fall, and so that it can be used for irrigation at other times of the year. I guess one of the key considerations for this type of approach is that it does require collective action. And it does require a lot of resources, and this could be a real barrier to tea farmers at small scales. And then lastly, some adaptation options for managing sort of very heavy rainfall. Again, includes maybe perhaps introducing some water management infrastructure like channels, and even afforestation on upwards and downward slopes to slow down the flow of water or to direct heavy downpours away from tea crops. But again, this is another example of an adaptation that requires collective action and possibly even quite considerable resources. It might be something that's more accessible or available to tea growers at larger scales, and a bit more help is needed to make this a possibility for tea growers at smaller scales. So I think just a couple of takeaways from this very brief example of a program which came up with a lot of really rich information, and just to draw on a few things that some of our colleagues have said. I think the real success of this project or this investigation was again how the climate science information was integrated so closely with the experiences and data and information from the tea growers themselves on the ground. And I think that this is a really important element for being able to adopt and move forward with adaptation solutions and to build resilience. So thank you.
Thank you, Louise, for bringing these experiences from Africa. And with this, I request if there are any inputs or any questions from the floor is most welcome. Otherwise, yeah, Mona ji.
Thank you. This is a very interesting array of different experiences, different geographies, and different methodologies being used. I'm curious to understand from the panelists, Shiraz Sahab, what is the user response? You know, user behavior at the end of the day is key to sustaining all of this thinking. So if there are any insights around that, I'm very curious to understand those. Thank you.
So if anybody can respond to the question which Mona Chabraji has asked, especially if Nivedita or Louis, if you can respond, or maybe Saqib or Aditya, the user's responses.
So, if I understood the question correctly, that is the user's response, after our interventions in our area. So, yeah, peri-urban area, if I talk about the same case example that I was presenting, it was a difficult terrain to start the work with because a lot of incohesiveness is being felt in the urban and peri-urban areas. Communities are not so together or cohesive in nature as they are in the rural areas, and since they have been facing a lot of adverse impacts of development and climate change both in the peri-urban areas, they were very resistant to sort of adopting or embracing any kind of new technologies that were coming out. The farmers, where they had only one option in that area, is to just sell off their land, which actually led to the land use change and hence the degradation of ecosystems, and do some small businesses or something like that. So once we entered there, a lot of community dialogue, shared learning dialogues, and after so many interventions, when they embraced this, what we also felt as an outcome of the whole intervention is that the farmers stopped selling their lands. So that was one of the biggest outcomes that because once they started seeing the remunerative agriculture portfolio basically that they were getting, then they stopped selling their land and they said, okay, we can make a good amount of money from this as well and sustain our livelihoods. So yeah, so initially resistance, of course, Monaji, but then over a period of sustained work, that led to behavior change and the change in actions that they adopted. Thank you.
Any other response, if there are? Yeah, please.
So again, I think in terms of the response that we've been having, it's been very well received, and I would say at times far more than we can support. Because let's not forget, today I'm here talking on about you young farmers working in the climate resiliency activities. I'll maybe step across the pavilion and talk about some of the work that I do on climate finance. Maybe tomorrow I'll talk about some of the other research areas that me and my colleagues are engaged in. But for the young farmers, this is 100% of their time, their resources, and let's not forget money. It might be small amounts in monetary terms, but it's consistent, and it's all the time that they're having to scrounge for little bits of money that they can put into innovations that they're doing, trialing and error. And in times it fails, that just sets them back by perhaps another harvest season by a year or so. And again, it's about building those meager resources back up to do this all over again. And again, that's one of the reasons that we really engage from the academic sector, is being able to help them with the innovations, being able to give them that little tweaks that they need to make sure that the innovations that they're working on, perhaps adapted on their traditional knowledges, but what is the modern way of doing so, perhaps a more technological way of doing so, using a bit more of a systems approach on apps and digital mapping. All these resources that we're able to help, just being able to give them information and then figuring out what is the best way of building these networks and building these collaborations that they can do. So I would say it's highly in demand, and as much as you can throw at these areas, please find as much resources as you can, find somebody to support.
Thank you. Karunaji.
Dr. Vaji, I have a question for you. Since Farmers for Earth started from an initiative, an idea that you had, and we have covered India in a small way, but we have, why don't we take it beyond borders? We have people from Bangladesh here. We have somebody from who's worked in Africa. Let's start with our immediate neighbors and share information across borders about how farmers can benefit from ideas and from techniques that have been successful elsewhere. Your technique for having that Machan agricultural systems, I'm sure every flood, flood plain in all the other countries, whether Bangladesh or Pakistan or Nepal, would benefit from that. So may I request you to take the lead with all your knowledge, with all your connections, to take this beyond borders. And I'm not saying physically meet, but I'm saying do it by webinars.
Very true, Karunaji, fully agree on this. And in fact, I mean, what I feel is that number of things actually are already happening, and it is also to horizontally connect with other experiences, like, I mean, what we have heard in Gobeshana kind of interactions in Bangladesh, or maybe some community-based adaptation mechanisms in other countries. So, I mean, what are those practices which are helping the farmers in terms of saving the earth, conserving the natural ecosystems, and also helping the small and marginal farmers and the women farmers? So that kind of horizontal connect is very important to be made, and also to share some of the experiences which everybody has. So yes, fully agree that it should go beyond some sporadic examples here and there. Fully agree on that. And the networks like ARA is here, so I mean, we have great opportunity. If there are any other inputs or any questions, otherwise we move to the one more important phase of this session, that is summing up and evolving the recommendations and way aheads. And we have two persons for this job, I mean, what we had requested. One is Dr. Aditya Bahadur, who you have already heard from the adaptation perspective. And we have Mr. Srinivas Srinivasji, Krishna Swami, who is the founder of Vasudha Foundation. And Srinivasji is an economist by training and has over a decade of experience working on the issues of economic reforms, sustainable development in the environment. Vasudha Foundation is currently working on a wide range of projects around renewable energy, energy efficiency, and policy-related campaigns, and lobbies both of the national and international level, while promoting green and alternative technologies at the grassroots level, creating the crucial link between energy and poverty alleviation. I'll request Srinivasji to please come on the dais. Please. Welcome. So, who goes first, mitigation or adaptation?
This is the first time at the COP that adaptation has gone first. No, I think that was a very rich discussion. A tough job to sum it up. I'll start from the bottom and then go backwards. I think the point on cross-border learning was a really valuable point, and I'm here at COP representing the Adaptation Research Alliance, and Rosalind is also here with us, who co-chairs it. And one of the raison d'etres of these alliances is to take models and approaches that have worked and amplify them across contexts. And we have a rigorous learning and sharing program as part of the alliance. And we have many members of the alliance already on the stage, and I would invite them to use this as a platform and as a mechanism to share these innovations and insights so that we can increase the scale of these successes. But just touching very briefly on some of the things that were said. Louise, congratulate you. I think these were the most beautiful slides I have seen at COP. And I think beyond the style, there was a lot of substance there. And I think I particularly liked your emphasis on scenario planning, because we have to move away from planning for a very narrow climate future, because time and time again, we know that that never really happens. So I think kudos to this initiative for underlining how this can be done and for underlining that this must be done. I also wear a hat of promoting locally led adaptation, and one of the key principles of LLA is to do robust climate analysis using scenarios of the type that you described. So I really like that emphasis there. Saqib, I think the emphasis on leadership isn't as prominent as it should be in discussions on adaptation, which tend to be technical. And I think what you brought to the panel was a realization that we can keep working in our narrow little boxes, but unless we have leadership, we're never going to have an amplified impact, and we're never going to get value for money from investments made. So thank you very much for that. And Nivedita ji, knowing a little bit about the remarkable work that GAG has done in the peri-urban space, I think what you said was really exciting for a couple of reasons. One, as you pointed out, peri-urban areas fall in a twilight zone between highly governed cities and rural areas. And these are kind of the ungoverned patch of land. And I think that is a problem, but that is also a big opportunity for innovations such as yours that can take root and really flourish in these places like you have. And I think your emphasis on understanding incentives for how to make sure that peri-urban areas can continue to deliver the vital ecosystem services that you need, on which cities are dependent, is crucial. I think this is a really interesting thing that GAG has done, try to understand how do you really increase farmer income so that it doesn't just get taken over by land sharks and becomes the next informal settlement or the next ugly condominium building around cities. So yeah, again, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this extremely rich panel, and I'll hand over the mic to you.
Thank you very much. Is that better? Okay, this way. Okay. Thank you very much, Shirazji, and a very good afternoon to all of you. Generally speaking, if you look at the AFLU sector, as they call it, the agriculture, forest, and other land use, there is very little focus on the mitigation aspects, because that's something that a lot of people do not pay a lot of attention to, because A, the general perception is that the AFLU sector's contribution to emissions is sort of fairly low. This again largely could be because when you talk of the AFLU emissions, you talk of net emissions, where the sinks account for a good amount of removals. But remove the sinks out and just look at the gross emissions, you will see that, and if you also look at a trend of the AFLU emissions globally, it's actually been on the rise. Whether the rise is very steep or whether the rise is sort of steady, but there has been a rise. I would say it's a steady rise, but there's been a rise. So let me put this give you some sense of the numbers, just to put it in perspective. So as of 2019, I think the global emissions was, this is the India, but I'm just going global and then I'll come to India, was roughly about, say, 49.76 billion tons. And the emissions contributed roughly about 15.5%, something like that, 15.11%. Now, if you actually look at it in terms of numbers, so that is close to about 7.5 billion tons of emissions from the AFLU sector alone, which is a fair amount of emissions. And within that, the largest contributor to that is the livestock sector, which is contributing to 53%, rice contributing to 12%, and the devil, so to speak, the synthetic fertilizer contributing to 11%. Coming to the India example, I mean, the India, of course, there are countries like New Zealand that have a much, much higher AFLU emissions than countries like India. But if you look at the India example, our AFLU emission was about, and these figures are from a civil society platform called the GHG Platform India. The GHG Platform, I'll just take half a minute to say what the GHG Platform is. The GHG Platform India is a civil society collective that came together at the sidelines of the Peru climate meeting in 2014 to put together independent emissions estimations for India and the state year on year from 2005, and now we have figures till 2018 accounting for the CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, and also and it's for all the states and for India as a whole. And of course, it covers all the sectors of the IPCC, like the energy, the agriculture, forest, and other land use sectors, the waste sector, as well as the IPPU, the industrial product and process use sector. So if you look at the India example, the AFLU sector contributed to about 5.7%. The livestock was the biggest contributor within that, which is 63%, and urea contributed about 14.95%, and rice contributed to about roughly about 7%. So basically the story is that mitigation is something that will have to be addressed. It is a very sensitive issue. Even the government of India doesn't really want to talk about the agriculture emissions, so to speak, because it also has a bearing on livelihoods. But then, are there solutions that can reduce the emissions without impacting livelihoods? Are there solutions that can be, because without the emissions, I mean, if the affluent emissions continue to grow, and if countries are looking at a net zero by whichever year, 2050, 2060, 2070, you're not going to have enough land. And of course, there are other hard-to-abate sectors where, the sinks could act as an offset, but then if you can't offset everything. So you will have to address the affluent sector sooner than later. And again, another important aspect is that a large amount of methane emissions is from this sector, whether it's livestock and or whether it's rice cultivation, and methane, as we all know, is the biggest killer. So sooner than later, we will have to address this. So what are the solutions possible? I think within the whole ambit, of course, the no-brainer is no synthetic fertilizer. That's a no-brainer, which all of you have talked about, which I suppose is a given. But then there are other mitigation that, and of course, it's still a nascent stage on the research, but from the livestock sector, there are these livestock management practices. There's the feed additives that one can look at, and there are a lot of studies that are going into, mixing, for example, seaweed into animal feed to see if that reduction can happen. And so one is the livestock management practices that needs to be completely changed. As far as rice cultivation is concerned, again, that is again a sensitive issue, because you have a lot of rice growing countries and then you have a lot of rice eating population. Can you stop that? But yes, we actually did a small exercise in Punjab with support from GIZ, where we actually looked at the water intensive rice cultivation as opposed to the direct seeded rice. And the direct seeded rice, actually, the emissions from the rice from the direct seeded rice is far lesser. But there are other issues that one will have to look at. So this is something that one should explore. The other areas that one should look at from a mitigation perspective, again, is, of course, looking at more crop diversification, looking at more millets and so on and so forth, that again reduces your emissions. But of course, rice will continue, but can you look at other practices of rice? I'll stop here for now, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that mitigation for the affluent sector generally is not discussed, largely because it does have sensitivities, largely again because it involves the vulnerable communities of farmers. And as both Nivedita and Shirazji presented, there are a lot of these small holding farmers, and can you put them at risk by putting in mitigation measures? But there are possible, according to us, there are possible measures that can be done even with small farm holdings. But of course, it requires, it requires a fair amount of hand holding and of course, financial support from the government. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Srinivasji. And I request, if there can be some investigative researches on how ecosystems play a role in terms of mitigation. That is also because, the agriculture sector and the cropping mechanisms are certainly, some of the parts which are studied well, but the common property resources and the ecosystem services which exist and how they are contributing to mitigation, that is also something which will add value to people who are advocating for conservation of the ecosystem services and the ecosystems, natural ecosystems.
So there, one could look at other practices like certain kinds of plantation around farming, which again could act as a sinks. There are other methods, but but one will have to look at the numbers. I'm not sure how many people have done the numbers. I'm sure the Agriculture University and others have done the numbers. A lot of people are getting into it. Particularly from the livestock, there's a lot of research that's going into the livestock emission reduction, because that's going to be huge and that's going to be growing in the coming years.
So if there are any other point which anybody want to suggest at this point of time, otherwise let me thank you all for coming to this session, even though it was a lunch time, skipping your lunch, delaying your lunch. Thank you the panelists, great panelists, and of course Srinivasji for your time and your inputs, very helpful. Thanks Karunaji and Day Network for the support which you extended. Thank you all for coming, Monaji and everybody. Thanks a lot.